All right. So hello, my name is Lei. I am the CVA Community Volunteer Ambassador for the park. Right now we're going to do our usual consent statement. So as a visual disclosure, we'd like to inform any participants that any and all of the Zoom series is and will be recorded. The purpose of this is to provide the Zoom series to those who participated or missed out on the session. It is also provided the information for participants to refer back to. In addition to the visible disclosure, this statement will be orally stated at the beginning of each Zoom series like I am right now. So I will stop my sharing. And now we're going to go on to Nico.
Thanks, Lei. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm pretty excited to talk a little bit about getting to know birds. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nico Ramirez. I am the lead interpretation park ranger here at the Santa Monica Mountains. My experience with birds is I would call myself an advanced birder. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert. I wouldn't call myself an ornithologist. I would say that I'm a bird enthusiast. And I really enjoy kind of talking about birds and kind of their relationships with us and their relationships with each other. So that being said, just a little bit more about me. I've been involved in the Park Service since 2013, where I started at Lava Beds National Monument, which would be the pictures that you see with the caves. I've worked at Acadia National Park, which would be that top picture, Pinnacles National Park, which is where I'm holding the baby falcon. I've worked at Crater Lake National Park, and then here at the Santa Monica Mountains. And then I did some work in Utah at the Red Cliffs Conservation Area as well. So I've been around. Birding I kind of got into in college when I took a tropical ecology course and we went to Costa Rica. I'm not somebody who has a life list, nor do I use eBird or really write things down. I'm more just kind of interested in looking at them and enjoying them. I'll probably start writing them down eventually, but it's just something that I've always really enjoyed, and I've really just thought birds are something that really just makes us think about how we view how things connect and how animals are related to each other and how they work together. I also really enjoy geology. As you can see, I'm in caves, there's mountains, and I've done a lot of talks on bats. So my partner who's there on the left when we're wearing helmets, she's a bat biologist. My brother was a bat biologist. His wife's a bat biologist. So bats are kind of in our blood a little bit. So that's a little bit about me. Without further ado, where are we going today? We're going to talk a little bit about why birds are important, how to get started with birding, some tips and tricks for identifying birds, and then talking a little bit about birding by ear and a couple of resources that are really cool to help teach with birding by ear, and then looking at what feathers tell us. So feathers really tell us a story through molt cycles. Now, molt is a really, really, really complicated process that birds have, but we're going to just dive into really just the surface layer of it. We could totally do an entire other talk on just molt and how bird feathers are used for identification and other information. So that's kind of where we're going today. So without further ado, let's get started. So first I want everybody to use the chat feature if you can, to respond on what does a bird represent and what do birds represent to you? And you can just type it right into the chat if you have access to it. So I see freedom from James and Greg, life from Carrie, amazing ability to fly from Phil, freedom, nature, the next stage of dinosaurs, beauty. Awesome. Freedom, because they can move easily in 3 dimensions, from Sonia. Part of the ecosystem. Great. So you can keep on, if there's anybody else joining us, you can keep on typing them in. But yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at. When we look at this, we think about how things are connected. Birds help us think about how the world is beautiful. I mean, they're so different than us. They're so different. There's nothing like birds, in this world, that they're able to fly and they're able to cover distances and they're able to live on every single continent that we can't really survive out in unless we had some kind of shelter or some kind of really external way to survive. So birds are really, really fascinating, and they do represent things like freedom and things like that. So thanks for responding to those. I'm going to close out the chat box for the, oh, actually, no, I'm going to leave it open because I want you, next step is how are birds, or why are birds important? So go ahead and type in why birds are important. So they're part of the ecosystem. Spreading seeds, consuming insects that bite me. Important part of the ecosystem. They tell us about the health of our ecosystem, keep rodent populations down, part of the food chain. Part of the food chain, help regulate the environment. Exemplary citizens and parents. Keep ecosystems at equilibrium. They make me happy and they're part of the ecosystem. And they eat insects. Awesome. So exactly. So birds are a necessary part of our life. They inspire people in many ways. Yes, they actually have inspired technology and the way we think and a lot of different things. Awesome. So I'm going to close out my chat box so I won't be able to see it. So birds are important for a lot of things that you mentioned. So seed dispersal is one that is really important. So birds that eat fruits, of course, are going to digest the fruit and they're going to drop the seeds. And the seeds are help, of course, for plants to propagate and to move. So seed dispersal is really important. Pollination is really important as well. So pollination so that plants can pollinate and they can grow and seeds and fruits then can be created. So birds are really important pollinators and for us to really have a lot of the foods that we have. So we have bees and insects, but birds are also a major part of spreading pollen as well. Population control through predator-prey relationships. So insects, rodents, other birds, they're a very important part of the ecosystem. They regulate populations. So things don't go out of control because, of course, their role in the ecosystem, each individual bird has its unique role in either through its death or through its hunting. Scavengers, so they're really important for cleaning up. If we didn't have scavengers, and not, of course, just birds, but scavengers in general, they're the cleanup crew. They keep disease and things at bay that would could be put out into a wildlife population. So scavenging is a really important part, and they really save the world money when it comes to waste reduction by just removing all these dead bodies and eating the carrion. And then, of course, it was mentioned too that they kind of give us cues on environmental health. So these are eagle eggs, bald eagle eggs as a result of the DDT. So they could give us a cue on environmental health. And it was just shared with me by Sarah, the story of the canaries in the mines and how they would use them going down into the mines. If the bird would die, they would know it's not necessarily safe. So wildlife is a really important aspect of sharing with us on what our environment is like and if it's toxic out there. So getting started with birding, what's awesome about birding is anybody can do it, and the resources that you need don't necessarily have to be expensive. However, you can invest in two really important resources. So first, of course, is getting your bird guide, and this can be a book. This could be something when you're thinking about it is whether you like to look at photos or sketches. Personally, I use the Sibley guide and I like looking at sketches, but I also have the National Geographic guide as well to look at photos and look at sketches. So that is a preference. Having a physical book is always going to be good, I would say, if you're at home or if you're looking out a window. But sometimes now with our smartphones, it's easier to just get the guides. And some of those guides that are on smartphones are free. So you can get, of course, one that you pay for that might have more features in it, or you'd be able to get one that's free that will have features that are just as good as well. So there's a number of different phone apps that you can get. Foldable guides are also a good resource if you're out with a, and you don't want to carry something heavy, or maybe you're with something that's a little more textile and something that kids can use with their hands so they're not just holding onto a phone. So those are always an option as well. And then there's also the ebooks. When I went to the Dominican Republic, I couldn't find an app So I bought the guide using my Kindle, and then I had the Kindle app on my phone, and I was able to use the Kindle app. So you can always use an ebook if an app doesn't exist, so that you can take it with you digitally. So guides, of course, very important. And I like to have multiple guides, maybe one in the car, maybe one in my back, one by the window that I look at. That's just me personally, but you can really make it where you want and have them where you want. The next thing would be, of course, having binoculars. Now, binoculars, could do a whole talk on binoculars, and I have a link there from REI. They have a pretty good link that talks a little in depth about binoculars. But what you're looking at is your magnification power, and you're looking at your objective lens size. So the objective lens is going to take in more light. So the smaller the lens, the less light that's going to take. So you would need to use in brighter areas. And then, of course, the magnification is going to be the zoom on how close the object will be to your eye. So 8 zoom would be it's 8 times closer to you than the naked eye, than what you can see with the naked eye. So if you haven't started looking at binoculars yet, or if you are looking at binoculars, to me, a good one to start with is the 8x42s. Those objective diameters, so the more narrow, the more magnification that you have, the more narrow your field of view is going to be. So you'll have less around you. Also, with higher magnification comes more wobble. So if it's a heavier one and you're not using a tripod or a monopod, you're going to be shaking a little bit more. And if you're not yet caught up with being able to catch birds really quickly with the binoculars, size could matter. So and it also depends on the activity that you're doing. If you're just chilling on at home, maybe you have a heavier duty pair. If you're going on a really long hike and birding is kind of a secondary thing, you might want to have a compact size that you're using during the daytime. So these are all different things that you want to look at when you're looking for binoculars. And then, of course, there are the spotting scopes, which you can use for really far magnification, typically on some kind of tripod or a mount, so that you can look into nests or birds that are farther away, that if you don't want to spook them or you're trying to do photography, that you have a scope that can help you out as well. And I encourage you to look up links. There's, of course, a wide range of prices on binoculars. I could never afford right now a Swarovskis, so I'm rocking Nikon Monarchs, which to me are really, really good. And they were about $300 to $400 when I had bought them in 2016 before I went to Acadia. And I'm still using those. And then if you invest in a little bit of a better pair, you typically have a lifetime warranty. So if something happens, you can send them in. So those are really the only 2 things that you really need to get started. Now let's talk about what you're doing when you're actually viewing birds. So looking at birds and trying to identify birds takes time. And there's some simple steps that you want to pay attention to. And that's looking first at size and shape is one of the things that I look at first. It's the first thing you'll notice is the shape of the bird, the size of the bird. You'll be determining in your head, you'll probably already be trying to compare it to birds that you already know. Birding can sometimes feel intimidating because you're trying to think like, oh, what bird could it be when you have your giant guide full of birds? But you're pretty good already at being able to narrow down what it's not. So by knowing what it's not, it can really narrow down what it is and help you narrow down where in the guide you might want to look. However, you don't want to just go straight to the guide. So you want to look at how it compares to other birds. If it's by itself, you might know the size of some other birds that you're familiar with, such as robins or crows or certain woodpecker species in your area. So out here, you might compare a bird to a hawk. You might compare it to a crow or a raven or a scrub jay or an acorn woodpecker. So those are kind of the common birds in this area that just came to mind. So comparing it and then comparing it to itself. And what I mean by comparing it to itself is looking at its head to its neck or its head to its body, or, so flycatchers tend to have, if you look at the flycatcher image, it tends to have a bigger head compared to its body. Whereas if you're looking at it like a vireo or a warbler, their head looks relatively small compared to their body size. Kingfishers have really big heads and a longer beak. So if you're comparing the feathers, you can also compare the length of the feathers from the tail and the wings, the legs, the length of the beak compared to its head. For example, the downy woodpecker and the hairy woodpecker, they have very similar color patterns, but if you're looking at their beak size, the downy has a really small beak compared to its head, whereas in the hairy woodpecker has a larger beak, almost the same length of its head. So these are really important things that you can notice when you're looking at birds. So the size, comparing it to itself, sort of profiling in a way. and then looking at wing shape. And when I'm looking at wing shape, that's typically when I'm looking at hawks. So you got accipiters, buteos, falcons, harriers, osprey, eagles, vultures. So looking at these different kinds of wing shapes can help you determine where you might want to look in your guide. So size and shape is really important. And as you figure those out, sometimes silhouettes, you can figure something out just by looking at silhouette. The sun might be bright, it might be far away. And as you practice these skills, of course, you'll be able to identify these things. Color and pattern. So here's an image of an Anna's hummingbird that I actually took at Golden Gate. And you can see just the direction of the sun, what the male's plumage looks like facing me versus when its head is tilted to the side. So this is important because it makes you think about patience, right? You might want to watch the bird, not just look at it and then glance down at your book. You might want to watch the bird and see how it's going to move around, see what it's going to show you if it's just standing or sitting in one place, if it's perched. So this is the same bird in a matter of seconds, just turning its head. So that's really cool how you can see its plumage in such a different light, just by the way the light reflects on the iridescent feathers on its face. Another thing too is feathers can be hidden. So this is a ruby crown kinglet, and these two images are showing the same as the male, but the crown has been kind of exposed in one of them. So sometimes there's feathers that can't really be seen. So as you're paying attention to them and watching them, sometimes they're exposed, or if at a different angle, you might be able to see certain things that are hidden that'll give you clues on figuring out what bird it is if it's kind of hard to figure out. Similar looking patterns. So these are two birds that I've been seeing at the VC almost every time that I'm there recently. And we have the hooded oriole and the Bullock's oriole. And you can see the color patterns are similar, but you can see how it's different with the hooded oriole kind of having the mask around the eye, and the Bullock's oriole having that stripe along the eye. And if you look at the white is kind of different on the wings as well. So similar species can sometimes be confusing, but if you're not paying attention to these subtle little things, you might get confused on what bird you're looking at. Also, sexual dimorphism. So birds will look different. Now, the mallard and the female, this is during the breeding season, they look completely different. During the non-breeding season, the male mallard will look almost like the female. It'll have a yellow bill, but knowing sexual dimorphism can help you determine sex and can help you determine what time of the year it is, of course, as well, if it's the breeding season or if it's going into the breeding season. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we go into the molt. And then, of course, looking between adults and juveniles. So some adults don't have different plumage. So, for example, the California scrub jay, they have similar, if it's a male or a female, it's going to have the same plumage, but the juveniles will look a little different as well. So juvenile plumage versus adult plumage is different as well. So these are all things that you're looking at when you're going to be looking at your guide. The little brown bird. How many times people come to the visitor center and I saw a bird and it's little and it's brown? And you're like, oh, I really wish I could help you, but could you give me a little more information? So if you look at these sparrows from the top left, I'll read them from the top left. You have the white crowned sparrow, then we have the white-throated sparrow, then we have the fox sparrow. Now down in the bottom left, you have the house sparrow, the female house sparrow, and then a song sparrow. So all of them are little and brown, and maybe if you catch a glimpse of them and they fly away, they might be a little harder to recognize, but there's a really important tip that I think about when you're looking at birds, and that's where's the white. I learned this in a bird identification class, is looking at where is the white. So birds that have white or have different patterns, the white tends to be pretty prominent in a location that'll really help you figure out the feature. So that white throat patch is a real, if you know, it's like, oh, that white throat patch stands out with these sparrows. When you open your guide, you're probably going to be able to narrow it down to that. Or the white crowned sparrow, you're looking at the way the stripes are on the head there. So where's the white is a really important tip that I think about when I'm identifying birds. And then learning the parts of the bird as well. So the guides will usually have this is really detailed from the Sibley guide on the parts, but knowing the belly, the throat, the nape, the eyebrow, the eye ring, things like that are really will help when you're identifying birds or when you're asking about how to identify birds. Or if somebody's talking to you and you're giving them information, it's like, oh, well, what did the belly look like, or the back, or the nape, the back of the neck. So knowing these things can also help you if you're a volunteer out there doing some of the birding. And I know that we have a couple of very advanced birders that are here as well. Behavior and habitat. So beyond now the surface layer of the bird, we're looking at their behavior. And this is where birding gets exciting for me. I like watching a bird and just staring at it and seeing what it's going to do. So on the left, I have two pictures. We have the white-breasted nuthatch and the brown creeper. And one of the things that you notice about these birds, if you're watching them, is the nuthatch will typically it's also known as the upside down bird. It typically hops down and goes down the sides of branches and trunks, whereas in the brown creeper will typically fly down to the base of the tree and then creep up, creep up, creep up. It'll forage, it'll eat some insects, and as it's creeping up, and then it'll fly back down or fly to another tree, fly back down the bottom, and then creep up and creep up. So paying attention to these behaviors and where they are located in their habitat will help you also learn more about the birds. So if you're looking for a particular bird, you know, oh, well, the creepers are typically hanging down pretty low and hanging up here. Or, oh, I'm looking for some vireos and some woodpecker species that will hang on the canopy. So knowing that there's various levels, so even when you're birding and you're standing in a spot, scanning the ground, scanning then the understory and the midstory and the canopy and above, like those are all going to get you different species of birds. So by knowing what their preference is, that'll help. And I think I sent in my bird of the day emails, which I know I haven't done in a really long time because I've been very busy. So those of you who've been waiting for bird of the day emails, I apologize. But just looking at one tree, you can see so many different species come to the one tree. And by looking at different parts of the tree, you may just see different neighbors using different parts of the tree in different ways. So this is a really good way on studying their behaviors. Other things that you're doing is you're looking at their habitat when you're looking at where they are. So this is a wren tit, which is a very common bird and well-known bird for chaparral environments, which is one of the dominant ecosystems we have here. And this wren tit hangs out real thick brush. You typically hear it. Its song is like a bouncy ball. It's like, and it's really hard to see sometimes. So by knowing where its habitat is, you're able to look for it. And yes, I see a comment here. They're known as kind of the voice of the chaparral or the song of the chaparral. So a great points. Thanks, Carrie. So these are really cool things that can help you figure that out when you're looking at behavior and habitat. So let's try again. Okay, other tips and tricks. So don't try to multitask. So psychology actually tells us that we can't multitask. So if you think you're a good multitasker, you're just pretty good at being distracted. At least that's what I tell myself. So multitasking, you should focus on the bird. You want to study the bird. So if you're looking at the bird and trying to look in your guide and looking at the bird and trying to look on the guide, you're going to miss a lot of that information. So studying the bird for as long as you can before looking at your guide is what you want to do, because once that bird flies away, it may not come back. However, some birds might. For example, flycatchers. If you study their behavior, a lot of times flycatchers that are perched, sometimes they'll fly, grab an insect, and return exactly to their perch. So by being patient and by just watching the bird or watching where the bird is, you'll be able to gather as much information as you can. This will help you focus on behavior. And then once the bird leaves, if you're not following the bird, if the bird's completely gone, then you might want to take a notepad and write some things down, because if you're looking at other birds and you don't want to miss other birds, you want to jot those things down. So that's typically things that I can do. I'm sure some of the other birders at the end, if you have information on like tips that you do, we can open that up at the end. Don't move around and you want to be quiet. How many times people I've seen on the trail saying they're looking for birds and they're going for a walk with their dog? Not a really good idea. Dogs are predator species. They're going to be moving around a lot, and you're going to be moving around a lot, and they're going to be scaring away the birds as well. So being able to stay still and be patient is a really important aspect for looking for birds. If you're going to an area where there's a lot of people with a lot of dogs, you want to go before the dogs and the people get there. Sometimes people go hiking and they're looking for birds, and if they go a little bit later in the day and they're going on a really busy trail, you know, there's a good chance that the busyness, if the birds aren't used to people around, you know, if you're in a more wild area, that birds can be kind of scared away. Also kind of the timing during the day as well. So yeah. Oh, I accidentally hit the wrong button. Apologies. What is happening? Excuse me, I think I hit a button. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, thinking about the placement of the sun is also important. If you're looking out into the sun, you're probably going to see more of a silhouette. So placement of the sun, that's not always going to be helpful. So that's why looking, kind of knowing shape can help. Following the flock. So sometimes the bird will come to you and then you'll watch the bird and then you'll follow the bird and the bird might lead to you. So sometimes birds are in groups. If they're foraging, a lot of times birds will congregate, especially if you're looking at home and you have a bird feeder and everything like that. So following the flock can be really important as well. Just because you see in your feeder, you may see, say, 10 juncos, you might have 20 or 30 juncos in the area. So knowing that one bird or a group of birds can actually be a sign of other species and birds of the same species being in an area as well. So kind of following the birds and looking at what other birders are doing. And this can be digitally or it can be out in the field. So looking at what other birds are doing, if you're looking at eBird and people are posting where birds are going, or if you see somebody out there looking at a bird with their binoculars, you may want to see what they're looking at, or even ask them. So a really cool way that you can connect with other people in the community. And then don't forget to listen. One of the biggest things I had to do when I went to Acadia was, when I was leading bird walks, was learn to bird by ear. So birds have songs and calls. They're different. Songs are typically sung by males, and they're usually used for defending territory or attracting a mate. And they're very melodic. Sometimes they're not, depending on the species. Calls are simpler. They're typically one syllable. They're used for alarms, contact, flight, and begging. And then other birds can also do things like drumming. They can use the environment. You can use the environment to help you find if they're scratching the leaf litter, like the towhees when they're walking or hopping around on the understory, or if they're splashing in the water. Drumming by the beak or the bill by woodpeckers. Different woodpeckers have different drumming patterns. So by knowing their drumming patterns, you can also identify birds. And then sounds that birds make with their wings as well. So grouses will almost do that beating sound where it sounds like they're pounding their chest. Whereas in a common nighthawk, when it's flying really high in the air and it swoops down, you hear this kind of vroom sound when they dive. So bird wings can tell you a lot too. Just the flap of the wing can sometimes tell you what the bird is. For example, when I worked at Pinnacles, looking at condors, you can hear a condor coming because they're a big bird and their wings are pretty loud, unless you're an owl and you won't hear the wings. So some resources that I thought are pretty cool. One of the ones I really wanted to show everybody is Larkwire. So I'm going to open this up now. So this you can either get on iOS devices, so only iPhones or iPads, or you can get it on the computer. And Larkwire, if you want to learn bird songs, is a really cool way to learn them through like a game. So it has a browse where you can browse. So this is the online version. So it's a demo. So it only has 7 birds, but you can actually create a playlist. So if you know what bird species are in your area, you can create a playlist and then it'll use the playlist. You just select it and it'll select those birds. And then you will be able to play the game. And what it does is it will play a sound and you'll select the bird and you can keep on going through it. And as you get them correcter, as you get more correct, it'll add different versions of the song and they'll get a little bit harder. So this is a really good way to practice your calls. So, and then as you do that, it can get harder and harder. And then as you see here, there's clear tone songs with rough tones. So it really breaks them down into like sounds and similar sounds as well. So it'll mix and match them for you. So this is a really great app, especially for kids. It's learning bird calls and songs is like learning a language. So you got to practice them, you got to listen to them, and you got to do it daily. So I use this app over an entire spring before I went to Acadia, because I got hired as one of the ornithology rangers there to do bird walks. And this had me 100% ready for the birds when I went to Acadia. So this was a really cool app. Go back to here. Other things you could do is All About Birds, which I've been sharing online with some of the folks when I do the bird of the day. You can use CDs, you can use the phone apps. Some of the phone apps have the calls on there already. And then there's Xenocanto, which is a really in-depth, detailed database of bird calls that you can search by species or location. So these are really cool resources that you can use. So that was a mouthful. So that is looking at the bird from the surface and listening to them. So birds, of course, they have feathers, and feathers to me are really, really fascinating. So I'm going to do a real brief description on like molt here. And feathers can really tell us a story, and it can tell us about the age of the bird if you're a bird bander and you're looking at the bird. So a lot of these things that I'm sharing here are information that's collected by bird banding stations. It's not something you'll be able to see directly. You might be able to determine whether a bird is an adult, a male, a female, a juvenile, but you won't be able to determine a lot of the really in-depth information about its age, necessarily its sex, its stage in the breeding, unless you're holding it down, holding the bird in hand and looking at it right up close. So there's different kinds of bird feathers that we have. Of course, when you're looking at birds, so typically on the surface, what you're seeing are the contour feathers, and you're looking at wing feathers, tail feathers. So these are the feathers that are on the outside that to protect the feather, protect the bird. They provide shape. They also provide waterproof layer to protect the insulating feathers, such as the down and the semi-plume feathers. Bristle feathers can be found kind of around the eye or the mouth, and this kind of acts like a whisker. It can help with feeling and vibration, but it can also help with catching insects for some birds as well. And then file plumes are kind of seen to be used as whiskers and display as well, and they can feel vibrations. At least that's what ornithologists seem to think. And all these feathers, of course, are really important to the bird and the health of the bird. So birds, when they're molting and when they're growing their feathers, they use a lot of energy, especially the males. They'll use a ton of energy when they're trying to create a plumage that is for mating, for the breeding season. So feathers start out differently, and they tell us a story. So birds are born, when they hatch out of the egg, either they're able to hit the ground running, literally, or they need to be taken care of by the parents. So there's precocial and there's altricial birds. So precocial birds, those are going to be the ones like ducks and fowl that are hatched and they're ready and they start running around and they need minimal protection or feeding and protection from the parents. And you have like songbirds and other birds that are born with no feathers, and they are altricial, so they are 100% dependent on the parents until their feathers come in and the protection, and they're typically in the nests and all that as well. So this is different stages that birds will have depending on the species. And as birds grow, so these diagrams are going to be a little confusing, but I'm going to explain. So when just on the surface layer of molt, as birds grow, they develop feathers. So of course, they need to consume a lot for energy. And then as they develop their feathers, typically their first year, they're growing their juvenile feathers. Now, juvenile feathers can look in different ways. So if you remember that picture that we looked at with the scrub jay, it was all gray. And then after it hatches, it starts to move into what's called, so this is a basic strategy. So this particular bird doesn't have a lot of different, in this graph, this particular bird does not have a lot of different color variations when it gets into the breeding season. So it'll have its preformative molt, it'll start to get its adult feathers. But if you look at the diagram, there's the dark orange feathers and then there's kind of the light brown feathers. Those light brown feathers are the juvenile feathers that are retained. So a lot of times when the bird starts to grow out of its juvenile feathers, it'll retain some of its juvenile feathers, which are typically the tail feathers and the primary and secondary, the flight feathers. Then they'll do their fall migration. They'll have their feathers, and then they'll do their spring migration. Then they'll come back, and then they'll go into their first breeding. So usually within the first year. So if you see there's the HY. HY is the, oh, I went backwards. I forgot I have a touch screen. HY is the hatch year, so that's basically their first year. HY and SY, so you have the hatch year going into their second year, and then second year, and then after hatch year. So after hatch year is when they have their adult plumage. So they'll go from their formative, they'll shed all their feathers, and then all their feathers, including their flight feathers, their tail and their wing feathers, and then they'll have all adult feathers. And then from every year after that, they'll be, after hatch year, they'll be having their adult feathers, and they'll be kind of going in and out of their different plumages. So this is a basic strategy that birds have, and they might be similar to a robin. So here I have a robin picture. It shows you the juvenile feathers. Then you see the first basic, so it's growing into its adult, but you can see that the gray is still the flight feathers and the tail feathers. And then once it goes into its next year, it molts all its feathers, and then it has its adult plumage. And then it'll do this every year. It'll just go from its adult plumage, it'll move and just replace its feathers over and over to maintain health and stuff. And looking at feathers and the length of feathers, the amount of time it takes for feathers to come in varies depending on the species. So some species it can take a month, some species it can take more than a month, it can take a few months, several months. Species that are in colder areas and certain aquatic species and shorebird species, they might take a shorter period of time because winter comes faster. So depending on the species, these molts can happen at different rates. And again, they take a lot of energy. So if a bird's it's not a good year with collecting food and energy, it can affect how it molts that year. So this one is the alternate molt. So this is going to be very similar, except they have a separate molt that they can show. And this is typically like a breeding plumage. So just like we started with the basic, the hatch year, it has its juvenile feathers, it grows into some adult feathers, retains some of its juvenile feathers, and it goes into its fall migration. Then it goes, as it's going into the first breeding season, it'll molt and it'll start to have some of its other colorful feathers. And then eventually it'll move on to the next fall migration, and it'll have its full adult feathers. And then the following, as it's an adult, this doesn't really show it well. There's actually 2 shades of blue under alternate plumage, but that's where it'll go to its kind of fall drabby male plumage to its showy plumage. And then it'll do that back and forth through a year. And the examples that I have here are the scarlet tanager. So the scarlet tanager has its adult plumage, or its juvenile, its first basic, and then it'll go into its first alternate. It'll still retain kind of some of those plumages, the feathers from the juvenile. Then it'll go into its full adult plumage, and then its full adult breeding plumage, and then it'll switch between the two between the seasons. And here you can see a non-breeding male scarlet tanager, which we don't have here. This is an eastern bird, and an adult male breeding. So it'll switch between these two throughout its seasons. Another example of that would be the western tanager, which is what we have here. So here's an adult female on the bottom left. In the middle, you have a non-breeding male and then a breeding male. So these plumages will switch as the seasons go on. And it takes a lot of energy for those males to develop all of those bright colored feathers. So having to develop bright colored feathers all year round wouldn't necessarily be a good way of using energy for these birds, which is why they'll have kind of a drabbier time during the off season or when they're not breeding. So let's see if I have any comments here. And yes, I got a good point from Sarah. So they do lose some feathers, and they lose them at a certain time. So typically they molt in a series. They'll lose certain feathers, and then the longest ones are going to be their primary feathers and their flight feathers. So they are able to still fly. Yes, great question. So birding and us. So that was a real nutshell on molt. Again, molt is a really, really complex thing. I'm going to show you a picture of a book. There's an entire book that I have on it, and there's these 2 volumes called, that you might hear them, written by Pyle, which is these 2 basically Bibles of bird plumages and being able to identify birds. Because if you're looking at birds at hand, sometimes you have to look at just little differences in the colors or the black tips of like the tail feathers to really identify the difference between certain species. So molt is a really complex subject, which I would love to go deeper into at a later time if you are interested. So birding teaches us a lot. I think more than just being able to identify as birds, it teaches us to be present. It teaches us to be one in that moment with the bird at the time. Sometimes not being even just looking around, but letting those birds come to you. is really important as well. And just being where you are. It teaches us patience. Again, if we're not trying to multitask and do it all at once, we really have to be still, and we really have to be patient and really just let the bird do its thing and let it tell us its story, so that way we can identify it and learn more about it. It teaches us to question, what is it doing? Where is it going? Why is it doing this? So it's a really cool way of helping us learn, which helps us learn perspective through observation. I really think birding is one of the best things that kids can do to learn how to observe and how to be patient and how to look at detail, because they can sketch it, they can look at pictures, they can use binoculars, and they can do it from home. It's something that can be done anywhere and everywhere. And it's a really, really cool way to really connect us to our nature and to our home. And then the world is connected without boundaries. I think those of you who said freedom and birds can fly, that's really important, I think, because birds don't have boundaries. They don't have the things that we do to isolate ourselves or to keep us separate. Birds are everywhere, and birds go everywhere. And that to me is a really, really cool idea, you know, and that we can look at birds and we can follow birds and we can travel and we can go all over the place to learn about birds and other things, just by kind of reducing that idea of boundaries, that kind of keep us somewhat confined to what is comfortable for us. Oh, these double clicks. So this is an interpretation. When we do an interpretation, a quote that I really love and that I look at every single time is, through interpretation leads to understanding. Through understanding, we get appreciation. Through appreciation, we get protection. And birding is a really good way for anybody to take those steps, to start to understand something, to observe something, to learn appreciation. And it's a really good way for us to think about how we do that in our daily lives and how we do that in other areas, by paying attention to detail, by being present with people, by being present with things that we don't understand, whether it's things that scare us like rattlesnakes and bats, or people we don't understand, or environments that are new to us. Seeking that understanding will lead us to that appreciation and eventually that mutual understanding and that love for one another and love for the things that we learn about. So birding really brings this home, I think, for us. I think it's a really great way for us to be connecting with each other and with our environment. So I want to thank you all very much for letting me do a talk like this for you. So if we have any questions, I'll do my best to answer. If not, we also have some other birders here that I think can help with some of the answers as well. And then I have some resources to share with you. So thank you very much. So these are some books that I use. The Feather book, this is the Molt book that I really like. And then the Cornell Bird Biology book is something I bought recently, that I think is a really cool thing that you can use. So, all right. Does anybody
Nico, I wanted to mention about binoculars, that if you divide the diameter of your objective lens by the power, it'll give you the size of the exit pupil in millimeters. So the 8x42 gives you 5¼ millimeter exit pupil. And that becomes important when it starts to get darker, either early in the morning or later in the evening, and your pupils get big. They're more able to accommodate a smaller exit pupil. Now, if you're out in the bright sun, it's typically, that's right around the area, 5 to 6 millimeters is where people's pupils end up. So if you, what I find, especially the little tiny opera glass style, the exit pupil is so small that you see people constantly trying to see what's going on because that tiny little exit pupil is moving all around. And so that's a thing to consider. You want to have at least 5 or 6 millimeter exit pupil.
Awesome.
Hey,
Thank you
Nico,
for doing that.
Nico, two things. One, there are binoculars that have image stabilization. And I know some people who have those, and they work really good for people who might have shaky hands or kind of a heavier set of binoculars or things like that, and they work really nicely. But the other thing is somebody had a question about what effects did the Woolsey fire have on bird populations?
That's a great question. So actually one of our researchers that does our banding out in Zuma, I talked to him a little bit about it, and he was saying that even after the fire, birds were coming back. So the species are going to be different because the vegetation might be different and the food availability is going to be different. But birds returned almost immediately, and they're able to kind of really come back. So that being said, depending on what area is burned, what plants are coming back, that's going to definitely affect what species are available with type conversion. And, you know, if areas were burned really, really badly and native plants aren't coming back, species that are that rely on certain plants might change. That'll also change what food is available. So the Woolsey fire, depending on the location where they're banding in Zuma, trying to remember what he was telling me, but I think they were seeing, I have to look at the data again to see what species, but there was more species, some species that were more prominent because of the lack of certain vegetation after the fire. So, but that's a great question to think, does fire keep the birds out? That's not really necessarily true. It just will change what birds will be showing up, especially during the recovery.
Nico, something I noticed right after, actually it happens after any of the fires that go through our park area, but that particular one, I personally noticed this, and I had other birders tell me that there was an influx of birds into the urban areas that people didn't typically see. Like I had a black-headed grosbeak at my feeder. I had an orange-crowned warbler, and birds that you just don't see around your house all of a sudden started showing up in the city. And then about a month later, they all went back. It was kind of interesting to watch.
That's awesome.
Hey, Nico, this is Mel. I have two questions, and I'm not sure if you addressed this one. What's the best time of day for birding? And also, the second question is, I remember back in the 90s hiking out in the Santa Monica Mountains and seeing golden eagles relatively often. And now I can't remember the last time I've seen a golden eagle.
So I'm not really familiar with the golden eagle. I haven't looked into any of the research that's here. I know that we've had a nesting eagles last year. I know, so I know that there are some eagles in the area. I'm not too familiar with the history of the eagles here. I haven't actually done any research on that. As far as the best time to bird, so birds, so when they're active and foraging, so there's a couple of tips that when we went birding, we would typically go early in the morning because birds are waking up, they're foraging. As the sun is coming out, insects are kind of being heated up and birds are kind of following kind of where the insects are going. Depending on the location and the temperature, you know, if it's really hot out, birds might be bunkering down. So kind of, but earlier in the mornings and later in the evenings when birds are really active. Out here, at least that's when typically people are birding, are going to be earlier in the morning. You can find birds during the day, but not always as active, especially when it's really hot out.
So there's a question about encouraging nesting of Western bluebirds. I know that there are bluebird boxes that you can put up, but do you have any other advice, Nico?
I don't. I haven't really done much. I don't know if anybody else here who's been in the area, but I don't have too much information on the bluebird boxes specifically.
Yeah, I know that there are some areas that they'll put up bluebird boxes for extra nesting spot for bluebirds. But another question, what birds should we expect to see around home feeders?
Around home feeders? So of course it depends on where you are. If we're talking about here, to be honest, I don't really know what the visitors are to feeders are because I haven't had a feeder out here. I mean, I can tell you what's around that I see in my neighborhood, but I mean, I'm used to seeing mockingbirds and things like that, but depending on the resources that you're giving. But does anybody else have some tips here? Because I really haven't observed any feeders around, being somebody who's been a park employee, and where I live, I don't have a feeder.
I don't know if you're interested in this, but just this morning in our really big, deep bird bath, in the front yard at least, we had a hawk come visit and take a bath. We have a video and lots of photos. So deep, wide bird baths really encourage them.
I mean, I've seen a lot of juncos and sparrows, and depending on if you have a hummingbird feeder, you'll have hummingbirds. Even the orioles will come up to the hummingbird feeders as well.
I have hooded oriole at mine coming all the time to my hummingbird feeder. Hooded orioles all the time. They're beautiful.
I think
I was going to address feeders. The birds you get will also depend on the kind of food you put out and the kind of feeders you put out. You could even throw seed on the ground, and also the time of year. In the winter, we have a lot more hungry birds, all the winter residents, the white-crowned sparrows, the Lincoln sparrows. Right now, house finches are very common at the feeders. A lot of people in the suburbs do get house sparrows as well. A lot of birds like your wrens, your house wrens and your Buick's wrens, they might come to a feeder that has protein like peanut butter or peanuts, but a lot of them eat insects. But if you put out mealworms, you might get them. But bird baths, shallow bird baths, are one of the best ways to get birds in your yard. And then just addressing the Cooper's hawk, they love to eat birds. So they tend to go where the birds are being fed. So it's very important when you feed the birds in your yard to put cover in your yard. And if you plant native plants, you get a lot more of the native birds. Like we have a lot of oak titmouths and Buick's wrens. Anyway, my 2 cents.
Thanks, Bonnie. And some other thoughts, that's a good point. One of the things that I like to stress when people are putting out resources for animals, if you're gonna be putting out bird feeders, then make sure you're committing to it, because what you're doing is you're creating a space for birds to come. And if you decide to be kind of lazy about it, or you're not providing that food when the birds are looking for it, you know, these birds are going to be habituated to this stop that you're giving them. And by you not providing that resource, you could be doing them some harm. Cover is a really important thing. And another thing to think about when you're looking at bird feeders or creating habitat in your own home is what feral cat populations are like. Feral cats are one of the biggest things that kill birds and bats. So if you have outdoor cat, you're just creating a place for birds to get attacked and possibly killed. So knowing those things about your environment before committing to these things is also really important as well, just for the safety of the birds too. Also glass windows and things like that. We had a feeder at one of the wildlife refuges that I worked, and it was a Cooper's hawk or a Sharpie that was smart enough to figure out that if it spooked the birds would fly into the window, and then it would get stunned, and then it would pick up the bird. So, you know, knowing those kinds of things is really important as well. So it's, I mean, kind of smart for the hawk, but at the same time, you know, things like that can happen.
Yeah, I just wanted to share, I've had bird feeders on my second-story balcony at my condo for, I guess, going on 30 years. And, but thanks to Bonnie, she introduced me to this a store that sells products for birds. And before I just had a couple of feeders just with a variety of wild bird seed. But after going in that store, they've got like a peanut butter-like substance that you smear on things, and feeders for, or I've been buying seeds for specific types of birds. So the variety of birds that come to my bird feeder, I'd say in the last 10 years compared to the previous 20 years is pretty different. I'm seeing a lot of stuff that I never ever seen before. So, and the song sparrows, who used to be very shy, what you see that fell on the floor of the balcony, they're now actually coming up to, the actual feeders. They're getting bolder. I guess they're just used to the food being there. So just wanted to share that.
Awesome. Thanks, Mel.
Is there historical data to compare how things are changing, if they're changing? You started off speaking about insect availability, which in turn feeds birds. We know that the flora has been altering over the decades, which would mean that the insects are and the seeds are. And aside from the big birds that you spoke a little bit about, the golden eagles, Mel talked about them, do we have any historical data to see how birds in general are adapting?
I have not done any research in my time here on any research that's been done as far as bird studies in this area. Some folks who may have been here for a long time may have something to add, but as far as the little bit of information I had from talking to one of the banders, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, climate change is something that's affecting birds all around the world. So if we're looking at how the effects of climate change and the increased heat is going to be affecting how certain bird populations will be able to survive. The Audubon website actually has a really good bird maps to show how areas are going to be effective, and it has projected on what populations might disappear or might move depending on the increased temperatures. So that's a really cool guide that I've used in other programs. So I would go to Audubon and look at just the climate maps, and you can look in your area, or you can look up a certain species and kind of see what their fate might be. As far as the change in flora and everything, anything that's kind of not small related to the Woolsey fire, I'm not completely familiar. I haven't done any dive into any papers or research on that.
Bonnie?
So we bought ourselves a bird feeder during the shutdown, just to use ourselves. We've had them in the past, but I bought a cheap one from Lowe's, and we found pretty soon that the local squirrels found out about it, and they ended up eating more of the bird seed than birds. So then I went back to Lowe's, and I found a more expensive bird feeder, about $50 actually, and it was very well engineered in that there was a surrounding cage which was outside of the cylinder that held the seeds, such that if the heavy squirrel kind of landed on the cage, it slid down and actually covered up the holes, so the squirrel wasn't able to eat the seed. Whereas the birds, which are much lighter, they didn't move the cage, and therefore they could eat the seeds. So anyone who's having problems with squirrels with their bird feeder could go to Lowe's and get this more expensive one. One other thing I've noticed as well, we get a lot of mourning doves around our home, and in contrast with other birds, they seem to be pretty mellow, and you can approach them really close and they will not fly away. They kind of look at you and say, hey, what are you doing here? But they're not sort of skittish like most birds. So I wondered if there's any reason for their personalities to be so mellow and kind of laid back compared to other birds.
Sorry, could you say that last part again?
I've noticed that mourning doves are much more mellow and laid back and not skittish like most birds. So they'll allow you to, kind of approach them really close, and they don't kind of fly away. So I wonder why that was.
Oh, I'm not sure. They might just be used to you being around.
Yeah, I think you'll see that is the case with different types of wildlife. Some get habituated to people more easily than other types of wildlife. And so you may see that with certain bird species. You might see that with certain animals. I know I worked at a park once where there was a red fox that became very habituated to people in the picnic areas, and he had no problem about strolling through the picnic areas. And, you know, amongst people, it was a concern, obviously, for us as park people because he should have been wild. But you will see certain species or certain animals that will become kind of habituated and used to human presence. And so they may be less likely to take off, which can be a good thing or a bad thing.
Which is interesting. At the VC, we've been seeing more birds show up than usual, which has been kind of interesting because I think the lack of visitation that was during the time everything was closed. So we actually unfortunately had a count, but we were trying to move as much stuff we could into the windows because we were just having birds run into the windows every day over and over. So there was an increase in just different amount of birds just with the lack of people around. So birds are going to respond to our presence.
So
So the squirrel thing is ever present. There's a whole book about it. There's some really pretty amazing solutions too. One of the best ones I saw was it was a bird feeder that was like cylindrical like this, and it pivoted. It would rotate. So if a squirrel got on it, the squirrel would just go wonk and hang there, and you couldn't eat it. But the birds, like the other one, the birds weren't heavy enough to make it turn.
Is there any information on the best native plants for the garden for birds?
I'm sure there's a lot of information on, I mean, you can do an entire talk, an entire demonstration on creating a native plant garden stuff. That would have to be a whole talk.
It usually revolves around butterflies though.
Yeah, but there's definitely gardens, and there's definitely, I mean, backyard birding habitats is a thing out there. It's really big. I am not so much the botanist gardening person type. It looks like Bonnie might have some thoughts on it, but there are a lot of resources out there, and I could look for some if you want on creating bird-friendly gardens, because backyard birding habitats are really important with allowing birds to have space.
So we had a speaker at one of our Conejo Valley Audubon meetings, and he's working with, or he is from UCLA, and he's working with undergraduates on surveying all the trees in Los Angeles to see which ones attract birds. So we're not talking all garden species. We're talking urban canopy now, and it was oak trees. Even the oaks that were not from this area, all the quadrats that had the oaks had more birds in it. So at least I could say one tree they're finding, and that research is available. If I need to, I can go look at my notes and dig up his name.
And if you have a big space to create a native garden, I mean, if you're outside and you're seeing what birds are using what plants, those are going to be the things that are going to be attracted to, if they're not too deterred by the urban environment. But specific species and stuff, I would have to do like a lot more research on just the whole art.
There's a lot of information online if you dig. So while I'm talking, I want to go back to the eagles. I didn't want to interrupt, but Mel asked about the eagles in the mountains. As many of you know, I worked at the park. I started in 1989, and back in the day, we had an eagle's nest kind of near Rocky Oaks. There was a piece of property not connected to anything that the park had bought. Actually, that was a peregrine nest, I'm sorry. But we actually had a lot of the raptors nesting in the mountains that aren't there now. from my own experience. I was monitoring a nest every year in the Simi Hills, and I don't remember the date exactly. I want to say it's in the mid-90s. The last time I had an golden eagle nesting in the Santa Monica Mountains that I experienced was the Simi Hills nest, which was recently referred to by Dan Cooper when they found the new golden eagle nest that's in western Malibu. My experience about the nest being abandoned in the Simi Hills is they just finished developing Lang Ranch. So the theory is that the eagles have a much bigger hunting ground than what is protected in the parks. And Lang Ranch was a huge open valley. And once that development went in, they probably lost their ability to easily find food. So I just wanted to throw that out to answer Mel's question.
There's a couple of things that I see in the chat here that I think is really good info. Recommending the Western Foundation of Vertebrate Zoology. I haven't been there yet, but I heard it's a really good place. One of the interpreters, somebody else here and I have been talking about going there for a long time. We haven't gone yet together. And then I saw a question from Mel about billions of birds, that you read something about billions of birds being lost over the decades, if that's correct. So it is true that bird populations are declining, have declined over the decades. A lot of it has to do with loss of habitat and climate change and other factors. One that comes to mind was when I worked at Lava Beds. Tule Lake was drained and made into a smaller lake by Bureau of Reclamation, and it went from like millions and millions of birds that was a stopover for waterfowl to now just a couple thousand of birds that stop every year. So those kinds of things and those kinds of changes drastically impact birds. Things like cats are everywhere. So birds are definitely populations have been reduced to a lot of the decisions and the development that we've made. But of course, things like creating native gardens and providing bird boxes and creating areas for birds, of course, are going to help reduce that.
And actually, I just thought of one question that's driven me nuts for years. Somebody claimed that the woodpeckers, poke holes in the trees and stuff acorns in them. One person claimed that, they're just storing it up for, as food for a later point in time. And then someone else claimed that, no, they put the acorn in the tree, which then attracts a worm or some kind of insect, and then they eat the insect. Which is true in terms of?
So the trees that they use are called granaries, and those are storage they actually eat the acorns, and typically these granaries are communal, so you have 15 birds. I've never heard of the thing about the worm. I've never heard of that. So when I show granary trees to kids, we're talking about food storage and all that kinds of stuff. So the worm is something I've never heard of. So it's either something that's slipped or it's not true.
Yeah, somebody claimed that years ago, and it's been driving me nuts for years now, because I tell people about the acorn, or why the woodpeckers were pecking on the trees and putting acorns in there, and somebody claimed that it would attract a worm or an insect, and that's what the woodpecker ate. Wasn't concerned with the acorn, but now I'm glad to know that it is the acorn that they're storing and eating. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Well, thanks everyone. Hope it was helpful. I know I'm not an ornithologist, so there's questions that I'm sorry I could not answer, but those are questions that are helping me do a lot more research. And I appreciate that you all came out today to join us, and I look forward to communicating with you all. I finally have a little bit more time, so I'm trying to add into my schedule the birds of the day so I can commit to that for everybody that I started. So I apologize for those of you who not gotten emails. But I do want to continue doing that because it's helping me keep up with birds, and I haven't been birding in almost over a year now because I've been so busy and just not focusing on it. So I hope this encourages you to be connected with birds. It definitely has re-encouraged me to get connected with birds. Thanks for your time, and Lay, take it away. Or Sarah.